Many of our guests so far, including Jeff, have referenced the larger emotional context within which their addiction began, psychological backstories that drove them to use and abuse substances, including the need for validation, things like bullying, physical or emotional abuse. In other words, trauma. And there is no better person to speak on the way trauma affects addiction than my next guest, Dr. Gabor Maté. Dr. Maté is a world-renowned best-selling author, lecturer, and a specialist on the cutting edge of addiction medicine research with some fascinating and somewhat controversial, but I think quite revelatory ideas about the nexus between trauma, early childhood development, and addiction. With over 20 years of medical practice in family and palliative care, Dr. Maté has decades of firsthand experience working with hardcore drug addicts. I find his insights quite compelling, specifically this idea that the source of addiction is not to be found in the genes, but in fact originates in the early childhood environment. The idea that addiction is complex and that there is no quick fix, and that we should be advocating for a more compassionate, less punitive approach to addicts, addiction, and treatment. I think you're going to really enjoy this perspective. So without further ado, this is me and Dr. Gabor Maté. What's wrong with our kind of conventional wisdom around the idea of addiction and where your kind of philosophy and ideas come in?
Well, traditional wisdom around addiction is either the legalistic one that has it as a bad choice that people make from which they have to be deterred by means of severe punishment. Hence, we got the so-called criminal justice system, which, by the way, I think is a good title. It is a criminal system. The justice system is criminal. The way it treats people. And
well, specifically addicts, sort of further traumatizing the people that are most traumatized.
Well, that's the whole point. Now, the point, though, is that that's the legalistic view, that addiction is a choice and people need to be punished when they engage in addiction-related behaviors. Their very addiction being illegal. Now, the other perspective that seems different is that addiction is a brain disease that you largely inherit, so it's not your fault because you can't help what genes you inherit, but it's a disease of the brain that arises in the brain, partly for genetic, partly for other reasons. And what both of those perspectives share, though, different as they are, what they share is that in neither case are we looking at people's life histories. And we're not looking at social history or the history of a country or a nation. So who are the populations that are most severely affected and what happened to them? And who are the individuals that are most severely affected and what happened to them? Now, my perspective is that addictions are attempts to soothe pain in every case. In fact, the drugs are specifically painkillers. Cocaine numbs and nerve endings. Opiates, heroin, these are painkillers. Alcohol is a painkiller. Cannabis is a painkiller. Crystal meth diverts you from the experience of emotional suffering by making you feel more alive and excited temporarily. So it's always not why the addiction, as you said, but why the pain. Keith Richards, who, when he was talking about his heroin habit in his book, Life, which is his autobiography, he said, and I'm almost quoting him verbatim, he said, the contortions we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours. Now, why would people not want to be themselves? Because they're not comfortable in their own skins. Why are they not comfortable in their own skins? Because they suffered in their own skins at some point when they couldn't help it. So what I'm saying is that addiction in every case, whether it's the severe addiction of the heroin addicts that I dealt with, or the respectable addictions of the workaholic, or I'm probably free to mention that you talked about your own addiction at some point to extreme endurance sports, and these are always based in trauma. So any attempt to escape the present moment has to do with discomfort that we incurred as children. And there are degrees of discomfort, degrees of trauma, but fundamentally addiction is always an attempt to escape suffering. So it's not the problem. The addiction is not the problem. The addiction
is the manifestation of the addiction is the solution to the problem.
It's an attempt.
And it works until it doesn't work anymore.
It works temporarily. In fact, that's my definition of addiction. You know, it's a temporary relief, pleasure, craving that is satisfied momentarily but creates negative consequences in the long term, and you can't give it up. That's what an addiction is. But yeah, that's what it is. It's an attempted solution. It's not the primary problem. And so to say that addiction is a primary brain disease, which is the official medical perspective that I was trained in, misses the whole point. But then again, the medical profession notoriously does not understand trauma. The research is totally clear. Like it's not that I'm giving you personal insights. I mean, I am, but these insights are very much also supported and grounded in a vast body of literature. And whether we're talking about addiction or cancer, you can look back to negative childhood experiences. So even on a level of physiological changes in the brain, we're looking at the same changes, just that some people use and need chemicals to achieve those changes. Other people get it through behaviors. Right. But the gambler is still after a dopamine hit, dopamine being the incentive motivation chemical. He's not after the money, because if it was about the money, he would quit after he wins his first jackpot. Right. But it's about actually the dopamine hit that he gets, that temporary state of elation and excitement that he gets when he's engaged in the activity. So all addictions, whether they're behaviors or substances or whatever they are, they serve the same psychological purpose of escape from suffering and pain, discomfort with the self, and they activate the same brain circuits with the same neurochemicals. So there's only one universal addiction process, drug addiction being a small manifestation of that.
Right. And because it's so divorced from logic and rational thinking, I think that's what prevents a lot of people from really truly understanding it, and why the conversation around it has to do with judgment and shame and criminology.
Well, I think if you want to explore that minefield, we can. I think on the individual level, the judgment and the disdain for drug addicts is actually well expressed by Jesus when he says, don't be a hypocrite, he says. That's the word he uses. He says, before you try to remove the sliver from your brother's eye, remove the pole from your own eye. And so what it is that when there's something we don't like about ourselves, then we'll look at that same thing in somebody else and reject it and imagine that we're different. So the workaholic businessman, or the workaholic doctor for that matter, or the shopaholic man or woman.
The guy who spends $8,000 on CDs.
CDs in a week. I've heard of people like that. And, they like to think of themselves as superior to the drug addict. And yet the dynamic is the same, which is being in the grip of a compulsion that you can't control, and that has negative consequences. And you don't have the power, at least you perceive that you don't have the power to regulate yourself. And so we see that in somebody else. And it's so easy then to look at the externals, which is that somebody's in a back alley in the downtown east side of Vancouver shooting up with heroin or cocaine. Oh, they're different from the rest of us. No, they're not. They're only different in their expression of their addiction. And they're also different in their social economic background often, and also, of course, in the degree of trauma that they experienced as children. So when we talk about addiction as a brain disease, yes, there's truth to that, but what shapes the brain is the environment. And the necessary condition for healthy brain development is non-stressed parents who can really connect with the child. So you can see in our society why so many people are affected, because how many parents are non-stressed? How many parents have the kind of support that traditional societies used to provide, the clan, the tribe, the extended family, where the child is always around adults who are looking after him. Not that I want to romanticize the past or nor that we can go back to it, but we've lost something. And so in this society, which is so disconnected, alienated, parents are, even if they're together, and 40% of the time they're not, but even if they are, they're both having to go to work, they're both under severe strain economically very often, relationship stresses, the spiritual emptiness in people's lives. Kids are being born into situations that no longer support healthy brain development. If on top of that, they're actually abused, which is what happens to most severe addicts, specific abuse in the form of physical beating, sexual exploitation, abandonment, neglect, emotional torment, that plays havoc not only with the personality development, not only does it give you a lot of pain that later you have to just soothe somehow, but it also distorts your brain development.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so now you have the template for addiction. A child under severe emotional stress has got very limited resources to deal with that. They can't fight back, they can't escape, and they can't change the situation. So now the brain kicks in with its automatic defenses. One of them is emotional shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
So now you no longer feel the emotion because they're too painful. But if you don't feel emotion, life becomes very dull and boring. Now you have to do drugs to feel better.
Right.
Or you might tune out as a way of not experiencing the stress.
Mm-hmm.
So you adapt by tuning out. But if that gets programmed into your brain, later on, you've got this condition called ADD.
Right.
Which is characterized by extreme tuning out.
Right.
You know, so what happens is that these early defenses help kids survive the immediate stress, but become sources of dysfunction later on.
Right.
So, as a matter of fact, I mean, as you well know from recovery, what makes the difference ultimately is not just one's own individual willpower and determination, but also others who can listen to you compassionately and validate your experience and not judge you.